Hey folks, this is John Lee and welcome back to the channel. So, assuming everything goes according to plan, by the time this video gets uploaded, it will be Wednesday, November 4th, 10:30 a.m. in Korea, which means that in the US, the elections are still very much underway and that people are still counting ballots, and no one is going to know who will have emerged victorious from the US presidential election, at least for another few days. And so, since we don't really know who is going to emerge victorious in this election, instead of talking about the horse race between Biden and Trump, what I want to do is talk about how this entire US presidential election and how the US government itself might look is being perceived here in Asia. Now, obviously, there is no such thing as the Asian view. There are 48 countries in Asia, 49 if you include Taiwan, and there are about 4.5 billion people in Asia. Depending on our age, depending on which country that we live in, depending on our political affiliations, depending on our education level, depending on our political interests and our national security concerns, we are all going to have different takes on what to expect from this election or what we hope from the election, or even if there's going to be any sort of significant changes, assuming that we even get a new US president. Now, for example, if we look at countries like South Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia, a lot of people in these three countries would rather see a Biden presidency. And it has a lot to do with the way that we have come to perceive Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has been rather antagonist toward trade deals, especially in the early days when he pulled the US out of the TPP. This has caused a lot of consternation among some Asian countries, like the ones that I just mentioned. But on the other hand, there are people in Vietnam and Taiwan who would much rather see a Trump presidency, and that's because their interests are quite different from the interests of the three countries that I just mentioned. For example, for people in Taiwan and Vietnam, these people are much more concerned about their national security concerns vis-a-vis China. A lot of Taiwanese today are quite concerned that mainland China is gearing up for an invasion. People in Vietnam are quite concerned because of these continuing infringements of their waters by Chinese fishing vessels and because of overall Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Now, obviously, not everyone in Vietnam or Taiwan feels this way. I am, of course, generalizing. But the reason why the support for Donald Trump is higher in these two countries that I just mentioned than those in other countries is that they are convinced that Donald Trump has the correct attitude toward China. And you're going to come to notice that as far as a lot of Asian countries are concerned, China is going to be that big elephant in the room that a lot of people are worried about or not talking about but still worried about in secret. Now, personally, I don't have a single shred of affinity for Donald Trump, and a lot of people probably feel that way too. But that doesn't really matter. Personal feelings don't really matter all that much when it comes to international politics. And whether we're talking about domestic or international politics, politics is always local. And the reason why so many of these people in Vietnam and Taiwan are convinced that Donald Trump has a correct attitude is that they've already experienced traditional democratic presidents before. And they're not entirely convinced that a Joe Biden presidency, if he goes back to traditional diplomacy, would really have their interests in mind. Now, sure, Joe Biden has begun to speak out against the Chinese Communist Party recently, but we have to take into consideration that this is not the first time that Democratic presidential candidates or Republican presidential candidates have talked tough in China, especially during election years. During election years, every single American politician just loves to beat up on China. But once the elections are over and the time to govern comes, they tend to kind of forget about all of that fiery rhetoric. It's the first time ever in the form of Donald Trump that a US presidential candidate's view toward China and a US president's view toward China is almost identical. There is an underlying sense of concern in these two countries that if Joe Biden wins the election and becomes the next US president, he will very quickly forget any of that tough rhetoric that he has only recently started to apply against the Chinese Communist Party, and that things will go back to normal as they did during the Obama years or the Clinton years. So all of these different Asian countries have their own different sets of national concerns, and so they are not in complete agreement as to what they hope for coming out of Washington in the next few days. But what all these Asian countries do have in common, however, is that we're not sure anymore if the US deserves our trust as it used to. Now, Asian countries' shaken faith in the United States is not Donald Trump's fault. Now, while Donald Trump did not help matters at all, he certainly exacerbated things, but this has been happening for quite a long time, and I posit that it's been beginning since 2001. And the reason why I say 2001 is that that was a year when Americans started to become a lot more concerned about Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism and therefore turned their eyes toward the Middle East and not even toward the more constructive aspects of having better economic or trade relations with the Middle East, but more with guns and jet fighters and bombs and targeting terror cells as opposed to building something constructive. And because America spent so much of its attention and focus on the Middle East and fighting terrorists, it has been felt quite for a long time that America has really dropped the ball when it comes to developing relationships with the Asian continent. Now, there was some hope that the United States would begin to invest more of its time and energy onto Asia during the Obama years. And after all, that was when the United States came up with this pivot to Asia strategy. Unfortunately, how that turned out was that a lot of the pivot focused more on the military than it did on diplomacy and trade. There were a lot more aircraft carriers and battleships that came into the Asian region than there were actually more trade deals. Now, Obama tried to balance that out by formulating the TPP, but as modern historians might know, as soon as Trump became president, the United States withdrew from that, and the TPP just kind of it does still exist in the form of the CPTPP, but without the US, it's not exactly as robust as it should have been. Now, the second thing that we can point to is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or AKA the Iran nuclear deal. Now, if you tell me that the Iran nuclear deal was a highly flawed agreement that allowed the Iranian mullahs to cheat on their obligations to continue building nuclear weapons, I really wouldn't be able to argue with you. I'm not a legal expert. I am not an Iranian scholar. I really don't know much about all of that is going on the ground. But what I do know is that the way things have been perceived, America has not handled this well. Now, the way that it is perceived, the United States withdrew itself from international agreements despite opposition from its allies, and even after withdrawing from the international agreement, the United States still wants to punish Iran for violating that agreement that it is no longer a part of. This is the kind of thing that tends to cost the United States a lot of support among the international community. Now, there are far too many examples to point to, but I cannot just simply skip over this next one. The next thing that is causing a lot of people in Asia to have serious doubts about America's ability to lead in the 21st century is, of course, COVID 19. Now, the number of American citizens who have contracted this virus, and the number of American citizens who have died from this virus, and the economic repercussions that the average American citizen has had to endure due to this virus, all of these numbers are nothing short of an unmitigated disaster. Now, it doesn't matter who becomes the next US president. Does Donald Trump get reelected for another 4 years, or does he get voted out and get replaced by Joe Biden? It really doesn't matter who is going to be the next US president. It still will not change that there are a lot of sick Americans, that there are a lot of people who are dying in America. Then this is going to be something that America really needs to get a control of. Now, countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Thailand might have had a relatively good handle of this virus. Perhaps it's also true that the People's Republic of China has also had a good policy of containing this virus, but their numbers are a little iffy, so we're going to ignore the People's Republic of China for just a moment here. But the fact is that there are a number of countries in Asia that have been able to handle this virus well. But in America, people are still debating whether or not masks work. There are people who are saying that wearing a mask is a way to virtue signal. And in Asia, this is seen as ridiculous. Now, once again, we have to talk about the way perceptions work. Right now, the way things are, a lot of people are wondering if the United States can ever get its act together. Can the United States get the number of COVID-19 cases to a more manageable number? We're not sure if America can do that, even if there's a new president come January. The economic burden that average households in Asian countries have had to bear because of this virus has been quite significant. And we can only imagine that the economic burden that American households will have to bear will be even much more significant, especially if American COVID-19 numbers are prolonged as the way things are right now. And if this keeps going, will the American economy be something that the rest of the world can still rely on as it has for the past several few decades? There's a lot of questions in Asia as to just how reliable America is, and we're not really quite sure how to answer that one way or the other. So outside of America, where people are not really all that enamored with the differences between the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, people in Asia, or at least people in Asia who are not hostile to America, are really concerned about whether or not the United States can get its act together in time, and whether or not it can even get its act together at all at this point. And so, whether or not who becomes the next US president, the United States is going to need to spend a lot of time, a lot of energy, and also a lot of money on rehabilitating its image because perceptions matter. Now, whether people are willing to accept it or believe it or not, Asia is going to be the beating heart of the world for at least the remainder of the 21st century, perhaps even beyond. Now, this concept used to be called the Asian century, but the problem with this concept was that the Asian century, as it turned out, in hindsight, was a little bit too optimistic. This concept was supposed to represent a utopian vision for the Asian continent, that economic development would go hand in hand with peace and harmony and individual liberty. But as it turns out, there is far too much historical baggage between Asian countries against each other. And so, in order for this Asian century, which is going to happen whether we want it or not, in order for this Asian century to be anchored, in order to make sure that it does not become too messy or too chaotic, there has to be a vibrant America. There has to be a vibrant Europe. But the way things are going right now, with COVID-19 ravaging both of these Western continents, with both of these continents becoming more inward-looking and insular, there is quite a bit of an underlying feeling of dread that what the rest of the 21st century is going to look like is anyone's guess. And that could be quite dangerous. So regardless of who wins this election, whether it is Joe Biden or Donald Trump, it is supremely important for everyone that the United States once again becomes a leading member of the international community. But in order to become a leading member of the international community, the United States needs to regain everyone's trust. Now, how America regains the trust that is lost over the years is, well, that's beyond my expertise. But it does need to do it fast. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. Hopefully, in the coming days, there will be a clear winner to this election. And for everyone's sake, I hope that whatever happens, things will be peaceful. Because the way things are looking in the news, things look quite scary. And as usual, if you like this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe and the notification bell. And if you have a comment, you know what to do. Leave it down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.